What? Are you kidding? We got us an awesome podcast here.
Welcome back to another exciting adventure of Rethinking Revelation. I'm your host, Travis Finley. This is episode 65, an interview with Seth Postell. I came across Seth's book, Adam as Israel, as a result of my co-host, Jonathan Sedlak, suggesting I read this book, and I want to tell you something. You need to read this book, Adam as Israel. Here's the back cover. The story of Adam is the story of Israel writ small. In this text-centered interpretation of Genesis 1 through 3, Seth Postell contends that the opening chapters of the Bible, when interpreted as a strategic literary introduction to the Torah and the Tanakh, intentionally foreshadow Israel's failure to keep the Sinai covenant and their exile from the promised land, in order to point the reader to a future work of God whereby a king will come in the last days to fulfill Adam's original mandate to conquer the land. Thus, Genesis 1 through 3, the Torah, and the Hebrew Bible as a whole, the Tanakh, have an eschatological trajectory. Does that not sound like it just came from my own brain? I totally think so. This book is absolutely fantastic, and so I'm excited for this interview. As a matter of fact, the interview went so well, Seth said he'd come back next week, next Thursday, the 27th. I have a scheduled interview with him then, because we can just keep talking about some of the stuff that we didn't get to finish talking about in this episode. All right, so some house cleaning issues. So I have corresponded with some fellow podcasters and talked back and forth and whatnot, and I'm soon coming up on the limit of space for my podcast, which then means I need to upgrade, which then possibly, well, not possibly, I just got to be honest with you, okay? So these fellow podcasters that I've talked to said, hey, you know what, you've got a good listening base, you've got a good audience out there, they should, if they're interested, throw you a couple bones. So I'm going to be looking into establishing a web page for this podcast, and on that web page is going to be a donation option. So I would appreciate that if you are so inclined, if you appreciate and enjoy these podcasts, and I guess you do because I see the numbers, but all that to say, yeah, I'm going to have to upgrade, which is going to cost a little bit more money, and it's not significant. I think if everybody throws like a buck, just throw me a buck, and that's a way to say thanks, and we'll keep this podcast going. So keep an eye out for that. I'll let you know when the web page gets set up, and it'll probably be, again, the donation through PayPal. So in the meantime, here comes the interview with Seth Postell.
I'm from New Jersey originally.
Are you really?
I am, from the promised land.
So do you have a soft spot in your heart for Bruce Springsteen?
No, I'm kind of a Billy Joel kind of a guy, actually.
Are you? Okay.
I like Billy Joel, but he was a New Yorker,
Yeah.
Thinking. Springsteen was from Asbury Park. That's southern Jersey, so that doesn't count.
Oh, I see. It's an in-house, it's an intramural conflict.
Where are you calling from?
I am south of Jersey in Maryland.
Oh, okay.
So I live in Abingdon, Maryland, which is about 20 minutes north of Baltimore.
Okay. Now, before the interview, am I allowed to hear a little bit about yourself? Because I don't know much about you. I mean, I've done a little bit of reading and stuff.
Okay, sure.
Are you a pastor? Love to hear a little bit about you.
I grew up in California originally.
Where?
Southern California, in a little city called Camarillo. And if you listen to books by Jonathan Kellerman, Camarillo actually gets a lot of airtime in some of his books because there was a mental state hospital there, and so he writes psychological thrillers. So every once in a while, I get little goosebumps when I'm listening because he mentions my hometown. But I went to college in Chicago at Moody Bible Institute.
So that's something we have in common.
How and what's that? Explain that.
I'm a Moody grad as well.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
You know what? I could not find like any biographical information on you. I have a friend who recommended your book, Adam as Israel, and he was telling me all this stuff. Yeah, he was a student of John Sailhammer and da 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 da. I'm like, how did you even know this? Because I can't find any information. It took me forever to figure out how to contact you. So when I finally got a hold of you, I was excited about that. So when did you graduate from Moody?
93.
93. Wow. We were there at the same time. I went in 92 to 96.
That's pretty wild. So I was there in the days of Lou Goldberg.
So yeah. So and then we had John Walton before he was John Walton.
That's right. I took Genesis with John Walton.
Yeah. And which you didn't get the genesis of the new John Walton, I'm sure.
No. I think, but there were some signs. There were some interesting going there.
Yeah.
I remember there was a big debate that started in his day as to whether the Hebrew Bible is actually messianic. And I think at that time he'd actually said that there's actually no direct messianic prophecy in the Hebrew Bible, that it's all secondarily so. It became that in the intertextual period. So that was the big debate in the day. So you know Paul Wegner?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I said hi to Paul. He wouldn't have remembered me. I'm trying to think, did I have Paul? I think I had him for Bible introduction, and he failed one of my papers. But yeah, so I brought that up to him. But I was walking by him at ETS back in 2010. I think maybe it was like 2014. I've got a friend of mine who goes to ETS, I think every year, and so it was up in Baltimore. When it was in Baltimore the last time I went down, and so let's see. Oh yeah, so I saw Paul walking through, and I stopped him and said hello and let him know that I was a Moody grad and whatnot. But I don't think he remembered me.
And did you live there?
I lived on campus. I was a dryer man. Were you a Colby boy or a dryer man?
I was dryer too.
Awesome. Wow, this is crazy. What floor?
Dryer 2.
I was dryer 3.
This is just pretty wild.
Yeah, so I actually went there the January semester. So I was only there for half a year in 92. So
okay.
but you finished out in 93, so you had a full.
You were on the floor with Trevor Good.
Yeah, I recognize the name. Yep.
Yeah. Wow, this is pretty amazing.
Ray. So what? Who else was there? Ray Fish. Did you know Ray Fish?
Of course. Who didn't know Ray Fish?
I know, right? He's so gregarious.
Fish. Yeah.
Some other guys. Yeah.
I actually smuggled in a chicken. I had a pet chicken for a while on Dryer 2.
Did you really?
Yeah. I did.
That is funny. Okay, so you finished out the year of 93. So you were there a full year. We were there a full year together then. Is that correct?
That's just amazing. Yeah, I finished in January.
Well, we wouldn't have had any of the same courses. I was a freshman, and
Sure.
you were on your way out.
Sure, but that's pretty wild that I'm sure we passed each other.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Now fast forward. I know you're supposed to interview me, but I'm really curious.
No, that's fine. That's fine. This is great. So then, when I jumped into the waters at Moody, I was just transitioning out of a dispensational paradigm to a reformed paradigm. So I was still getting my feet wet. I was given Lorraine Bettner's book, The Reformed Doctrine of Predestination, on my way in from my youth pastor. So I did a lot of reading on that and started to change the way that I think and whatnot. And when I discovered in the audiovisual department the videotapes they had for Ligonier. I spent many an hour listening to R.C. Sproul, and so cut my teeth even further on a Reformed perspective, and so then decided to go to RTS. So I went to RTS down in Orlando, and I was there.
That was R.C. Sproul's school.
Right, that's why I went down there. But he had by then he had left, and moved on. But had a really great experience there, and then I ended up graduating from RTS Charlotte.
Yeah.
And then after that, I decided to go. Well, I was always wanting to go into the ministry, but I was doing youth ministry, and eventually was ordained in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, in 2001, and held on to that for as long as I could, even though I never eventually got a call to the pastorate, and then finally gave up the ghost probably in 2011 or so, and relinquished my ordination, and I've just been doing layman kind of things since then.
Okay. And so you're working...
I drive a tractor trailer.
Wow.
All local stuff, so it's all I'm home every night. And we're a third party carrier for UPS, so we pick up parcel post from Amazon and other commercial magnets, and then also we do all local business mail as well. So plenty of work out there for that industry.
Sure, I'm sure, and I'm sure. And you're involved in a church in your area.
Yep.
And
Yep.
you get to do some teaching as well.
Well, no. My views have that's a little bit of the snafu with the ordination thing with the PCA. My views had started to change, and so there wouldn't have been an opportunity for me to maintain my ordination. I would have changed too much for them. So that, having said that scares my elders into allowing me to have a platform to speak or teach, because they're not comfortable with a lot of what I say. So no, but beside that, even our church right now is small, and where we have been, we haven't had opportunity for Sunday school, so we don't have that platform just yet. They're talking about starting one up, but I'm going to be an audience member rather than up in front. So I try to.
Do you mind me asking, what are those things that cause them concern?
Oh, that's far and wide. Primarily the my views on the sacraments in terms of their efficacy. I began to put more emphasis on their efficacy. And so there was a big theological to-do back in the early 20s, around 2004, in the PCA circles. And it was labeled, the theological jargon was labeled the federal vision. And so it really had to do with the nature of the covenant and the efficacy of the sacraments and all of those things, and whether or not Westminster spoke this way, and whether or not we can say that we have any support from the reformers to even speak this way about the efficacy of the. And so I started to side with talking about those things in a more robust way, and that rubs a lot of those guys the wrong way, because they feel that smacks back into a works righteousness motif if we're placing a lot of the emphasis on our responsibility to stay in the covenant and to use the sacraments as a means of grace. A lot of those guys, some guys are comfortable. They're like, yeah, okay, I don't have a problem with what you're saying, but if you're in the wrong presbytery,
yeah,
and I was in the wrong presbytery.
I see.
So, and then even after that, even if I hadn't changed in that way, my views on the end times and my views on eternal conscious torment is something that would have caused me trouble, I'm sure.
Like took a stop, like a, what is it called?
Annihilationism.
Yeah, John Stott.
Yeah. So yeah, that would have eventually gotten me into trouble as well. So I'm just a troublemaker.
Well, I think the one thing I can say is, like all of us, I'm pretty busy, and so I haven't had as much time to do. I've listened to a little bit of the things you were sharing, and just even reading your writings. And one of the things I can say, which I do appreciate, it sounds like you put a lot of thought into what you believe, and you're spending a lot of time studying, and that's very commendable. So that was something I definitely appreciate. It's actually inspiring and challenging for me. As I said, I've been the academic dean here since 2012.
Yeah.
And it's all that I've been able to do just to keep up on just the admin and college type stuff, and definitely have not had the time to do as much research as I'd like. It's
well,
praying and hoping that at some point that I can work myself into a place where I can be doing a lot more research again.
Sure. Yeah. I'm going to be hard on you and not let you get off on using that as an excuse, only because you've done enough study in the past, and the Spirit's at work in your heart and whatnot. So we can have, I think, a friendly conversation, and that's really what I'm after.
Okay,
I'm not worried about talking, a lot of scholastic jargon.
Yeah, if we want to talk text, the good news is that that's the one thing I have. I'm also an elder of a congregation, and I do a lot of teaching, and I still teach here. And I do read articles, and I have published a bit, but not as much as I'd like to. So, but I definitely love the Word of God, and that's my world. And of course, here in Israel, we don't have an updated modern translation of the Hebrew Bible, and so all of your preaching and teaching and everything in Israel comes within the context of the Hebrew Bible. So, it was good. I just wanted to, that's also, you helped me out because I wanted to know the nature of the conversation, because that would be helpful. I'm not much of a debater, and I'm not very quick on my feet.
Oh, no. That's not the intent of this at all. And I just posted my latest episode was with Pete Enns, and so I had a fun time talking to him. I was finally able to strong arm him into an interview because my friend that I mentioned before that I met down at ETS was his teaching assistant at Westminster. So my friend gave me permission to drop his name and say that he said, you tell Pete that he needs to do this interview with you. So I dropped the name, and Pete said, okay. But yeah, this is just an in-house discussion. You're not going to get sidelined, or sideswiped, and I'm not coming at you with any other agenda other than to talk about what my podcast is called Rethinking Revelation, and so it's intended to think through our interpretation of the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation, because I've been a Christian for 35 years or so, and my understanding of the nature of the revelation that God has given to us has changed so much that I try to help others see the scriptures the way that I see them now. And that calls us to take a step back and look at what we're reading. And I think that your book, Adam as Israel, is a phenomenal book. It's so funny because I don't think that it would have been a phenomenal book 20 years ago when I was at Moody, because I wouldn't have been ready. There's so many. It's so interesting the way God takes us through our own personal pilgrimages. But where I'm at right now and the way that I've thought through things in the past 15 years, I think has prepared me for reading your book. And I think that it's a tremendous work. I've been promoting it on some Facebook groups that I've been involved in with theological discussions. I'm like, you guys have to read this book. You need to read this book. And so I'm excited to talk to you about that.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. It was the crazy thing is, Travis, is that was actually my second dissertation. I had, when I was actually, me and another guy were John Selmer's last PhD students. He got very sick during the process that I was working on my dissertation, and pretty much my dissertation process was very much an on my own type of thing. I think he'd only commented on one footnote by the time I went to the defense. But the crazy thing is I had actually been working on a completely different dissertation, got about 120 pages into it, and then realized that I discovered a book that had argued pretty much my argument.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What was that?
Well, it's still a valid argument. So basically what I noticed was that the structure of the purity code is built on the poetic structure of Genesis 3:14 through 19. And so that in order to understand the purity code within the context of the Torah, you had to understand it within the context of the fall. And, I was finding some pretty interesting things, and just all the connections between, the Eden narrative, the creation narrative, and the tabernacle, and how that affects the way we understand the Sinai covenant. And so I had been, I'd been pretty deep into it, and then I discovered, what was the name of, Koichi, in Leviticus, in the Apollo series. He had briefly mentioned something about the structure of, anyway, long story short, I saw my argument. It was something that slipped by me, and it was something that, at that point, I don't think Selhammer was really was not really reading a whole lot at that point, wasn't able to. And so that kind of slipped by, but it turned out to be really good, because during the process, I discovered some things as I'd been looking at Genesis 1 through 3 that were kind of mind-blowing for me. And one of the things was, I'd always been curious about the function of the serpent in the narrative. It never made sense to me.
Yeah.
It just kind of goes up and disappears.
Yeah.
And long story short, some things kind of, while I was doing the research for another dissertation, and it was kind of handed me on a silver platter, and so I jumped back into that. I went back to that, or went into that, and it turned out to be, something that typically when you're working a dissertation, that's not your life's work. But in this case, I feel like my research there has so profoundly influenced the way I'm reading the Bible, the way I teach the Bible, that it's something I'm still in it. In fact, I'm working on doing a little bit of research now again on, Satan. I'm spending my 3 moments in the summer thinking about Satan, and there's so much popular theology about Satan that I've always wondered about. And so anyway, long story short, that to say that I'm really glad. That was one of those things that at the time was probably one of the worst days of my life, was finding out that I didn't, that my dissertation was over. But looking back, I saw God's hand, and I'm just really grateful that He let me come back and do Genesis 1 through 3. And since then, I've also spent a ton of time on Genesis 1 through 11. And it's been very refreshing, and definitely has altered the way I read the scriptures on every level.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So, all right, let's jump into a little bit of the formal part of my show. So I've talked enough about myself. I was going to have you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, your family, and just your likes and dislikes, anything that comes to your mind.
Yeah, so I'm actually we're talking from Netanya, Israel, is where coming from here. I live in the Netanya area. Netanya is about 20 minutes north of Tel Aviv on the Mediterranean coast. And I actually serve as the academic dean for the only evangelical Hebrew-speaking Bible college in the world. We're an accredited Bible college. I think probably the thing that most excites me about my job is that about 35% of our Israeli students are Arabs. One from Gaza. We've got students from Bethlehem, and we've had, we have Arab faculty members. We've had another guest lecturer from Ramallah. And so the thing that excites me is that we've really experienced the power of the gospel here at the college. We live it every day. Also, interestingly enough, our college has put a lot of time into developing media. Israelis are more online per capita than any people in the world. And that amounts to the fact that if your gospel message does not exist in HD quality in a 3-minute clip on YouTube, it's not that you're irrelevant. You just don't exist. And so our college has put in, we literally have a couple hundred videos, over 100 videos in modern Hebrew. And some of our last year, I think we had 3.5 million hits, which is quite amazing considering there are only 9 million Hebrew speakers in the world. And, a lot of people know about the things that happened in Israel in the past, but I can say that both among Jews and Arabs, we're seeing very significant things happening. The gospel is making progress. And so I get to serve this body of believers, Jews and Arabs, and we're very much a Great Commission school. Our motto is the best way to bless Israel is with Jesus. There's no other way because he is the answer for Jews and Arabs. And so that's what I do. Married, I have 3 beautiful, beautiful children. And what do I like to do? I do like to write. Certainly as the academic dean, I don't do it as much as I'd like to, but I do. That's one of those places that I think I have some of my most joyful moments is sitting and writing and researching. But I'm also an elder of a congregation, and perhaps the highlight of my week is teaching the Word of God and being with God's people. It's something I really, really love to do.
Is there a correlation in the church that you go to with anything in America that we can associate, in terms of denomination or flavor?
Wow, that's a good question. It's interesting. So just a bit of a background. In Israel, there are denominations that are primarily within the evangelical Arab congregations. So you'd have Baptists and different Pentecostal, Nazarene. Within Israel, the congregations kind of divide up among charismatic and non-charismatic, but they're all non-denominational. And so, I would say that our congregation is definitely more Baptistic. However, and this is an important caveat also in terms of our student body, although we're a growing body, we're about 30,000 believers in Israel, 25 to 30,000 believers. Because of the pressures and the persecutions and even the death threats that we get on our college and our media team, we tend to stick together. And so within our congregation, we really, just like in our college, we serve kind of a wide array of believers, everywhere from more Reformed to more dispensational to Baptistic to charismatic. We tend not to allow the non-essentials to divide. So I would say our congregation is definitely Baptistic in theology, but we really do serve a lot of different people. So I think you might have a hard time pegging us if you sat there. You'd have to actually see our doctrinal statement and our constitution to actually get a sense of, some of the things.
So what about the worship style? And do you have, I suppose, a history of music and song that you use, or do you use American hymnals, or do you have your own authors and history that's so interesting. I think about that every once in a while because we're so isolated in our own Christian experience here in America. But that's an interesting question. Do you have hymn writers in Israel?
Now that's a really, really good question. So In terms of the local music, we've seen it's really been an interesting things going on. Remarkably, I was sitting in our congregation this Saturday, and we actually have a Hebrew service and an English service. And in our English service, we literally have the whole world coming. But in the Hebrew service, I was thinking about the songs. A lot of our songs are simply scriptures that have been put to song. And so we sing a lot of psalms, which is really amazing. And believers memorize a lot of psalms because we sing so many psalms. There have been, interesting enough, years ago, and I don't know the whole history, but I think about 50, 60 years ago, some of the most amazing of church hymns were translated in Hebrew. And the Hebrew, the man who translated the songs into Hebrew, he had unbelievably beautiful Hebrew. I mean, just amazing. And these hymns have kind of come. It used to be that those were the hymns that were sung for years in the early years of the church in Israel, establishment of the state of Israel in the early years. Well, these hymns are starting to come back, and so we do have some hymns in Hebrew that you would at least recognize, that you'd recognize the hymns. And there are a lot of people that are writing music as well. Some of the music, I would say, you would definitely kind of imagine it as being something very Western, that you could picture the beat and the music fitting in kind of more of a contemporary service, a contemporary church. But a lot of the music as well, you definitely feel the more Jewish flavor. You definitely kind of sense the Middle Eastern context. And as I said, a lot of our music is just, this Saturday, I was looking at our songs, and I'd say 4 out of 5 of our songs were just words directly out of the book of Psalms. So,
yeah. That's fantastic. So, does your church publish any of the worship online by chance? I'd be interested to see if you have any of the music available, YouTube or anything like that.
Well, in fact, one of the guys I'll recommend. I'm happy to give him free advertisement. He's one of my students at the college, and just a great thinker. His name is Jamie Hillsden, and you can look him up in YouTube. Jamie Hillsden, Hilsden, and he has written some really phenomenal worship songs. And again, he's definitely a deep thinker, and he's a theologian, and so he takes very seriously the types of music and the kinds of the things he's putting out. So you'll recognize, there's guitars and a band and drums. The music is very well done and very well thought through. So Jamie Hillsden.
And how do you spell Jamie?
Jamie.
Okay. Great. Yeah, I'll look that up. Fantastic. All right. Well, you told us that you're originally from New Jersey. So did you grow up in a Christian home?
No. In fact, the only time I ever heard Jesus growing up was when my father stubbed his toe.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Hold on. I had to give a little rim shot there. Thump.
Yeah, that was, sadly, we didn't. I guess because of history, my mother lost. We lost. I don't even know how many, but well over 20 family members in the Holocaust. My grandfather lost half of his brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews and cousins, and of course, growing up in a Jewish home, sadly, we always thought that was done by Christians in the name of Jesus, and so Jesus was sort of an option that you could believe anything, you could do anything, but that would be the one thing you'd never get near. Jesus was a bad word in our home. And I think up until my early teen years, I used to think that Jesus was a Catholic, because I grew up in an area where it was 50% Jewish, 50% nominal Christian. So we're talking about North Jersey. I don't think I'd ever really met somebody that would have claimed to have been a born again believer. And so we had very little exposure to Jesus. The only exposure I had to Jesus was via Catholicism, and it was just, I think, one of the most amazing things for me to ever discover was Jewish and that the New Testament was written by Jews. I had no idea.
So how did you get exposed to evangelical Christianity?
So, and it is a very long story. I can give you Reader's Digest version of it, but my mom was the first to, she was challenged to start to read. Now, I grew up going to Hebrew school. I was at a Reformed synagogue every week. I'd go to Hebrew school. And in a Reformed synagogue, I don't ever remember talking about God at the synagogue, ever. But my mother started to, she'd met another Jewish lady that started to talk to her about Jesus. And my mom at first was aghast and offended that a Jewish person could ever consider and believe in Jesus. But my mom was the intellectual in the family, so she started to study. And she was challenged, and she, I think, started to read the Bible, the Old Testament, and was challenged to start reading the New Testament. And over a period of a few years, came to the crazy conclusion that Jesus is truly the Son of God, the Messiah. She came home and shared that with the family.
Wow.
My father was very angry. He was very, very angry, and he said, okay. In fact, I do recall my mom said that when she first told him that, he cried. He said, I thought I married a Jew. And basically said, you can keep that to yourself. Don't talk to anybody. Keep it away from, I was the youngest. I was still, at home. Keep it away from our son. And basically over the years, my mother's just started praying for the family. And we saw some pretty amazing changes in her life. And one by one, we started to consider the claims of Jesus. One by one, we started to read the scriptures. And I came to a place in my life where I was very much under conviction of my lifestyle, very much aware of my sinfulness, even though I was at a young age, but I had a very strong sense of there was something wrong. And came to faith.
So how many family members became believers?
Yeah, so my mom first, then my dad, then several of my siblings. Yeah, pretty much my whole family. Yeah.
So what was it like when your dad? He's like, okay, everybody, come in here. I got something to tell you.
Well, the interesting thing was when my father finally came to a place where he was willing to consider. He said to my mother, he said, okay, and I wasn't there, but I heard about this. He said, okay, I see that Jesus has been a good thing for you. And I can actually see that, I see it's a good thing. So why do you believe in Jesus? But please, I don't want to see the New Testament because again, I grew up under the assumption that because Christians did such bad things to the Jews, that the New Testament must be an anti-Semitic book. And so there's something about a Jewish person touching a New Testament because you're convinced it's filled with hatred towards Jews. That's just how you're raised. And so my dad said, I'm willing to consider Jesus, but please, I don't want to see the New Testament. Don't talk to me about the New Testament. So my mother read to him Isaiah 53. And when he heard Isaiah 53, he got really angry. And he said to her, I told you I did not want to hear the New Testament. And my mother said, Murray, that's our Bible. And it was as if his world had collapsed. And he looked at her and he said, listen, even if this is true, I can't believe it. There's, he was just hanging on to, but over the next several months, he came to the conclusion that he couldn't ignore the truth. And so, the man who was once, the man I remember that used to curse the name of Jesus came to a place where I saw him many times. He would cry at the name of Jesus. And,
Wow,
so,
that's amazing. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. That was great.
Sure.
So what, do you have an online presence anywhere? Do you, if I wanted to, in the show notes for this episode, I can put in websites and whatnot. So if there's any place we can visit you and see other things that you're doing, is there an opportunity for that?
I think the best place, the name of the college is Israel College of the Bible, but our umbrella that contains both our college and our media department is called One for Israel, ONEFOR, Israel.org. And what you'll see there is you'll get access both to the college, and so we actually have some online courses in English, and you'll get access to some of the things that are going on in terms of our evangelism, both to Jews and Arabs. And as I said before, and that is important, I think the evangelical world is very divided on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and they tend to look at it as Pepsi and Coke. You're either a Coke man or you're a Pepsi man. And we've decidedly taken a very Jesus-centered approach, and we believe that God loves Jews and Palestinians, and so we don't want to do anything and everything we can to see Jews and Arabs come to know Jesus. And so that's who we are, and you'll see that reflected on the website.
Great. Do you have any upcoming future academic writing or speaking engagements?
Well, interestingly enough, so my book, Adam is Israel, and I was really amazed by the response. I didn't expect that. And so I've gotten some encouragement over the years to make it a more accessible version. And then another thing that we deal in our context, one of the issues that's still very much center and forefront is the law. What do believers do with the law, particularly Jewish believers, but not a few Gentile believers that are constantly asking questions about the law. And so we felt, and we got emails from people that had basically left the faith and converted to Judaism. So we felt like we needed to do a response. So we self-published a Kindle book that now is actually going to be published with Weaver Publishers called Reading Moses, Seeing Jesus, which is our attempt to show that the Torah's goal really is Jesus, and that it's not, as John Sailhammer says, not extra Jesus, but exegesis, and that it's a careful reading of the scriptures.
Okay.
So
I like that. Yeah.
That's one project. I've also been involved. Interesting enough, Moody Publishers is producing the handbook on Messianic prophecy, and so I was asked to contribute several articles for that. It's supposed to be published February 2018. I think it's a really exciting project. So that will be published. In terms of speaking engagements, I will be speaking at the Divinity School at Liberty University. I've been asked to do some
really
there in October.
Oh, I might have to make that 5-hour trip.
Well, you are welcome. I can even give you the dates. Let me see here. I've got to open my calendar. It's October. Let's see here. October 16th is a Monday. And the topic of the lecture that I'll be doing in 2 different classes is the problem of the Messiah in the Torah. And the reason I call it the problem is because, I don't know if you're familiar with the Counting Heads approach to Messianic prophecy.
No.
The Counting Heads approach says that the Messiah has to be a very marginal topic at best in the Hebrew Bible because there's so few verses that actually deal with the Messiah, if you even accept that they're Messianic. And the Torah in particular is a problem because classically there may be about 10 verses in the Torah that are considered Messianic, even historically. And yet Jesus said in John 5:46, if you believe Moses, you believe me because he wrote about me. In other words, if you look at percentages, you've got 0.022% of the Torah is Messianic versus about 65% deals with the law. And so then the question is, in what sense can the New Testament be correct? In what sense was Jesus correct? How is it possible that Jesus could say in John 5 that even before his resurrection, that the Pharisees, the religious leaders, would be accountable, that Moses would judge them, not Jesus, because Moses testified about him. So I'll be speaking on the problem of the Messiah in the Torah as a lecture.
And that's on Monday. Is that an evening presentation?
No, well, I think it's a morning and an afternoon, and then in the evening, I forget the times. in the evening, I've been asked to share with the student body to share my testimony, how I came to faith, and talk a little bit about Jewish evangelism in Israel today.
Huh. Okay. Fantastic. All right. I just had to take my drink of coffee there, get my little jolt. When I have my guests on, I have a presentation of questions that I have tried to create in order to paint a picture of reading the Bible for the first time. Again, if we're familiar with it, or simply reading it for the first time if you're coming to it without any previous experience. And so as I look back on my experience, I think of, okay, now how would I ask this question, and how would I nuance this? So as I mentioned before, Rethinking Revelation, my podcast is intended to, I think, try to promote, obviously, like you've already talked about, the person and work of Jesus, but reading the Bible is, in my opinion, a lot more difficult than we think. And in my experience, I grew up in a Baptist church, so I've come from I think that I've had a decent experience of a pretty good taste of how people read the Bible. And so my desire is, one of my questions to you will be, how do you read the Bible differently than Joe Christian? Or my term is Granny Smith, because she's just that little bitty that sits in her home on her chair reading her Bible, and she just wants to see Jesus. But it's a whole lot more robust than that. So when we talk about the difference between the way you read the Bible and the difference from the way that I read the Bible, and the difference between the way Granny Smith or Grandpa Joe reads the Bible, it's pretty significant. And I want to talk about that significance. And there's a way to do it, in a way not to do it. A way not to do it is that you scare people off in thinking that they can't understand the Scriptures. But at the same time, the reality is we have to have more information in order to process. And I think that your Adam as Israel is a case in point. You cannot come away from your book and not and so if I gave your book to my pastor, I would hope that when he closed it, he would say, I have to read the Bible in a completely different way. So that's my desire with this podcast. My desire is for us to talk about, and so your answers are going to be different than Pete Enns' answers, are going to be different than Michael Heiser's answers, and John Walton's, and my pastor, and all that kind of stuff. So that's what this is about. So here come my questions. Are you ready for them?
Sure.
What would you say to a person? What does a person need to know before he even thinks about reading the Bible? What does he need to come to the Bible with in terms of a mindset?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and you'd sent me the questions earlier. I've thought about it, and I think part of the problem that kind of creates a situation in which it's hard to understand the Bible is that when you open the Bible, you see numbers. You see verses and you see chapters. And automatically it sort of brings you to a place of learning the Bible by verses, by bits and pieces. It almost creates a situation where every verse and every chapter is an island unto itself. And, I think that one of the things that I would want to do, and I try to do this when I disciple people, is to get them to consider the fact that books are whole. In other words, the goal when you open a book is to read the book. The goal is to actually understand the book as a whole. In fact, with the book that I wrote on Adam is Israel, I think the driving question I had for the book was not how do I understand Genesis 1 through 3 in the context of creationism or in the context of evolution. The driving question I had was, how does Genesis 1 through 3 function as the introduction to a book called the Torah? And that was a question I asked myself over and over and over again. And so I consistently and constantly tried to understand Genesis 1 through 3 and to look for those connections in the rest of the story. And I had so many aha moments. So I think that the thing that I would simply say is, the pre-understanding that I would give to somebody is, it's crucial for you to understand that the chapters and verses are there to aid you during a sermon to find your place. But in terms of Bible study, they're useless. You really want to read whole books and to look for the ways in which whole books hang together.
I got a little sense of passion there for a minute when he said they're useless. Yeah, that was good. That was good. I had a thought. Okay, so yeah, let's go back a little bit and let's imagine you have two different Sunday school classes and you have an option, right? The one option is for the Sunday school classes, and they've never had an experience with the Bible before, and you let them read the Bible on their own. Just say, just read it. Just go at it. Just have at it. Or you have a class where you say to them, okay, before you even open this book, you need to know something. You need to know more in order for you to understand what you're reading. I'm not trying to demean you, but if you read this book without what I'm going to say, you're going to misread it. Which of those do you think is more helpful? Letting someone just go at it, or saying, listen, you are a toddler playing with an automatic weapon, and it's dangerous, and it could cause a lot of harm.
You know, my mentor, John Sailhammer, there was something about him that was both invigorating in terms of every class was like an Emmaus Road experience where your heart was burning and you saw things that you never saw before. But in another sense, one of the things he used to say is that in order to understand the Bible, you have to read it. And, you know, here's where you and I may differ. I don't think we would disagree, but maybe differ a little bit. And that would be that I actually do believe that I believe that the Bible was fearfully and wonderfully made. I do think that, you know, there is something about our generation that has been uniquely equipped to read the Bible, and that is we know how to watch movies. I think that we have an intuitive sense that movies hang together. Good movies have great introductions that usually don't answer questions but create problems and conflicts that the rest of the movie has to solve. And many times you come to the end of the movie and you have these aha moments, and then you go back and you reread you re-see the movie, and then things start to fall together even better. And I would just simply say, again, what I would simply say is that I would encourage people to understand that the Bible has been fearfully and wonderfully made. It is, in fact, where people would say they're simple child stories, I would say, you know, hold that judgment off, because this is very sophisticated literature. So you need to realize that, you know, maybe I would say that the way that, in my experience, the way the biblical literature works is that you have an introduction, you have a body, you have a conclusion. And you want to pay particular attention to the introduction. You want to notice the ways in which the introduction is brought up once again in a conclusion. And you're going to want to see how the body relates both to the introduction and conclusion. And I would encourage them to read over and over again. I would encourage them to ask really good questions. I would most certainly join them in their quest. And when I see that the questions are kind of off base, when they're asking questions that are not textually driven questions, I would encourage them to get back on task. So, I guess that's how I would see things, and I'm not so sure I would say much else than that. Although maybe if you prod and poke me, there may be some more things I might say.
No, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. One of the principles that I jotted down due to a friend's post, in terms of principles of hermeneutics, I think either my first or my second point, it's probably my second point, I said, suspend interpretation. Don't draw a conclusion right away on the first reading. Tuck it in the back of your mind, keep it there. One of the things, again, that you already mentioned, right? You mentioned the mystery of the serpent in the garden, and then he's gone. Who is he? What is he? You've got to tuck that away because, as you talk about in your book, the connection with Canaanites, you've got to tuck that away, and that textual connection is going to be made later on.
Correct.
But if you make a Moody Bible Institute strict literal interpretation, it's a talking snake, and then later on we don't see any talking snakes, so it's over and done with, and you don't have the mentality of typology or whatever else you're going to use in terms of making those intertextual connections.
Just, I guess, in word of defense, at least I have a very dear friend at Moody, Michael Rydelnik, who definitely, I think, would share with me in many of my views in terms of textuality. He was also a good student of John Salian. Excuse me. So anyway, I would just simply say that, going back to the scriptures, I would argue, I guess another thing maybe I would say to somebody that's reading for the first time is that there's no random facts.
Yeah, I say at this... Go ahead, say that again.
There's nothing random. There's no random facts. And
yeah.
So sometimes Michael Riffater was a French literary critic that developed the notion of ungrammaticality. And he used it in the context of poetry, where he argued that ungrammaticality in a poem, whether it's semantic ungrammaticality, grammatical, syntactical ungrammaticality within poetry, was a sign, in fact, pointing to intertextuality, that it was intentional. And so that many times these rough edges in the text are there for a very important reason. And so that's what I would perhaps encourage people to do, is to say, when you come to a rough spot in the text, a rough edge in the text, just set that in your mind, but ask yourself immediately, how is this going to figure in as I continue to read? In what sense will what I read later help me to make sense of what I've read now? Mm-hmm. There are no random facts in biblical literature.
The way that I have put it in my podcasts is there are no fabula nuda. The stories are not naked stories. They're not just simply decoration. There's more going on, and we have to be ready for exactly what you just said. That was amazing. That was great stuff. Thanks so much. All right, let's move on. What does a person need to know before he reads the Old Testament?
Well, that's a really good question, because now the question is: are you assuming a non-believer? Are you assuming that I'm speaking with a Jewish person? Are you assuming I'm speaking with a Gentile Christian who's never read the Old Testament? Because that would really, my answer would depend on who I'm speaking with.
Yeah, I suppose I'd just, if you wanted anybody, if anybody you came across was going to start reading the Bible and they said, Seth, I'm going to start reading the Bible. And you go, okay, hold on now. Before you read the Old Testament, let me tell me something. Just go with that. Don't make it... Go ahead.
I mean, these are really good questions. Again, I keep going back to this, and I'm definitely taking this verse out of context, but fearfully and wonderfully made. Don't be fooled. Don't be fooled. Don't assume that these are just simple children's stories. Don't assume that, these are isolated fables or tales. Don't assume that there's no connectivity. I would again, I guess much like I would tell the people, what are the things you know before you need to start to read the Bible as a whole? I find that the Old Testament literature and the New Testament literature work very similarly. In fact, the New Testament was written, they had so imbibed themselves, they'd so much studied the Hebrew Scriptures that the very ways in which they're writing New Testament literature reflects the very ways in which Old Testament books have been made. So again, I would encourage the same approach that, read whole books, look for connectivity. I think the whole notion of intertextuality, in here in Israel, obviously people are reading in Hebrew. So I would encourage them to look and notice words that are repeated, notice verses that are repeated elsewhere.
Okay. So my next question would almost be redundant. So I'm going to have to make an adaptation and ask you to answer this question along these lines. My next question is, what does a person need to know before he reads the New Testament? So let me nuance that by encouraging you to talk a little bit about expectation and fulfillment.
Yeah, no, that's actually, in fact, here's the model that I had always heard for years, and that is that you need the New Testament to make sense of the Old Testament. And I've heard that approach for years and years and years, that you need the New Testament to make sense of the Old Testament. And I would, in some sense, there may be aspects of truth there, but I would argue that you really need to come at the New Testament with an awareness that without the Old Testament, the New Testament makes absolutely no sense. There was a book that I didn't particularly care for the book, but there was a chapter in the book. The text is a joke. The text is a joke. And it was a chapter on intertextuality.
Are you talking about Peter Leithart?
There it is. And the book itself, to be honest, I didn't particularly like the book, but I loved the chapter.
Yeah, that was a good one. I liked his analogy with the joke of the religious leaders going into a bar.
Yes,
and
exactly.
The bar, yeah.
I like the one with Lord Farquaad that's torturing the gingerbread man.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You know the Muffin Man. You know the Muffin who lives in Drury Lane.
Yeah.
But my experience is that so often the New Testament it brings with it. It brings with it the Old Testament context, so that like the 5-year-old child, where you'll tell a child a joke and he gets everything you said. He understands every word. He understands your semantics, your grammar, your syntax. He doesn't get the joke because he's missing the connectivity, the intertextuality. He doesn't have that. And I would say likewise, when you read the New Testament, I think it's crucial to understand that the Old Testament, you need to know the Old Testament to make sense of the New Testament. And I could give you one example. I'm actually going to be preaching on this in 2 weeks. In Mark chapter 4, the stilling of the storm. Mark chapter 4, in the Gospel of Mark, from 35, I believe it's till 40 or 41, it's quite remarkable that when you look at the details of the text, Mark's edition, or Mark's telling of the stilling of the storm hits several times. It uses language and themes taken directly from Jonah chapter 1, the Septuagint.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you have a boat, you have sailors in a boat, you have a storm, you have the boat filling up, you have people that are scared. They wake up the key character. Don't you care that we're going to drown? And then you have at the end of the account, and they feared a great fear. Now, what's remarkable here is when you look at the parallels themselves drive you to ask, they actually provide the solution to the question at the end of Mark, who then is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? Once you know the story of Jonah, you realize, well, who calmed the storm in Jonah chapter 1? It was the Lord, Yud-He-Vav-He, right? So who then is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? In order to answer that, Mark doesn't even give us the answer to that question. He points us to the answer to that question, Jonah chapter 1. So in Jonah chapter 1, they feared a great fear, the Lord, Yud-He-Vav-He. In Mark chapter 4, who then is this that, they feared a great fear? Who then is this that even the wind and the waves? The answer is Jesus is God. Now, Mark doesn't come out directly and tell us Jesus is God, but in order to get the joke, you need to know the Old Testament.
That's fantastic. That's absolute gold. Let me ask you a question. You seem comfortable saying the name. So, is the Tetragrammaton an issue in your circles?
That's an interesting question. In fact, there's a recent book written by R. Kendall Sulin on the name of God for Christian theology. And it was just a very interesting book. And what he argues is that in the New Testament, even Jesus did not actually use the name of God. In his argument, he says that in the Greek, that the Greek New Testament actually signifies the difference between Lord, as in little l, right, or Lord as in a title, versus Lord, which is a filler, right, a respectful way to use the divine name, Yud-He-Vav-He. And he argues that when the article is absent, that it's an indication that it is the name of the Lord, Yud-He-Vav-He. And so what he argues is the very things that were going on in Judaism of the day, the hesitancy to use the name of God, Yud-He-Vav-He, to pronounce that name, is a practice that continues to go on, that even Jesus does that, as well as Paul and the New Testament writers. In other words, they simply chose not to use the name out of respect.
Now, give us your pronunciation.
Oh, man. I don't know.
Well, no, but you were just saying it. How did you say it just a couple minutes ago?
I just said Yud-He-Vav-He, which are the letters. Right? So that would be the letters of the Lord. That would be the letters that are used, because obviously in the Hebrew Bible, the name is not... the pointing used for the name is the pointing for the name Lord, right? So, which is the practice you see in the Greek New Testament, and that's why they use the word kurios, Lord.
All right, so I'm sorry that I'm so slow. Are you pronouncing the Tetragrammaton then?
No, I'm just simply saying the letters.
Because it sounds like you're saying a dalet, but there's no D in Yahweh.
Yud-He-Vav-He, which would be the letters.
So is there a dalet in there?
No dalet. Yud-He-Vav-He.
Okay. Give us the consonants.
So it would be Yud, He, Y-H, Vav, or W.
Okay.
He.
So I'm just getting caught up on the phonetics of what sounds like a dalet. Okay. All right. Yeah. That's fine. Okay. I'm going to have to edit that part out so I don't look so ignorant.
That's fine.
I'm just kidding.
There's plenty of editing for me, so I don't look that ignorant.
No, not at all. Not at all. Okay. Let's see. What would you say to someone if they're going to be reading the Bible? You say, okay, you need to know that you should expect this whenever you read the Bible. What should you expect?
Wow. Yeah, so one of the things that I've noticed, and it came out really strongly in the book Adam is Israel, but it's in other research that I've done, is the importance of what's I've come to call literary analogies, and particularly in Hebrew prose, but also in the New Testament I see it as well. Literary analogy, John Sailhamer calls it narrative typology. Some people have called it typology. I kind of shy away from typology because of all the, there's a whole bunch of things that go under the rubric of typology, some of it textual, some of it fanciful and crazy. But what I would argue is that literary analogy, by literary analogy, I mean that a later story has been intentionally written with an earlier story in mind, and that's signaled by shared language and shared plot structure. And it's intentional. Or that an earlier narrative is written intentionally to foreshadow and prepare us for later narratives. And I taught a course here at the college last year. It was one of my favorite courses I've ever taught. It was called Literary Analogy in the Book of Genesis. And what I did is I prepared a PowerPoint that went through systematically the literary analogies that I find in the book of Genesis, and they are many. And in fact, I came to the conclusion that without literary analogy, it's as if the stories are you're going to read them very flatly. You're going to miss, in many cases, their point in the larger narrative. So that would be one thing I would encourage people to recognize as literary analogy. I can give you an example. And I'm sure you've heard it in the New Testament. One literary analogy, I would argue, if you look at the Gospel of Matthew, is built on the Torah's principle of literary analogy. That the rabbis call it ma'aseh avot siman lebanim. The deeds of the fathers were assigned to the sons. And so, for instance, if you look at the structure of Matthew, and I won't go into the whole structure, but at least in the early chapters, in the introduction to the Gospel of Matthew, it's intentionally setting Jesus up as a second Moses, a greater than Moses, and one who actually is Israel's champion. And so the book begins with a genealogy, very much like the Torah begins with a genealogy in Genesis. That's how it begins. In chapter 2, Jesus comes out of Egypt, right? In chapter 3, he goes through the waters of baptism. In chapter 4, he goes into the wilderness of temptation for 40 days and 40 nights. The order of his temptation follows the temptations of Israel, and in Israel, how does their temptations end? At Mount Sinai with the bowing down and worshiping false gods. Jesus is the one, unlike Israel, who succeeds and does not bow down. So he goes, and then from the wilderness temptations, he goes up a mountain in chapter 5, and he gives then his fivefold law. You have the Sermon on the Mount. You have a total of 5 discourses. And remarkably, whereas in the story of Moses goes up the mountain with some of his close associates, and he receives the law from God. In the structure of Matthew, Jesus goes up the mountain and he gives his own law. In other words, you see in all of it's an amazing thing that you actually see the deity of Yeshua in the very structure of the book. But it does so by drawing on parallels to the story of Moses, but then on monopolizing on the dissymmetry, the asymmetry between the stories. So it's the symmetry that calls our attention to key points, but not less. Many times it's the dissimilarity between the story where you have the theological punch. And so these literary analogies go all through Scripture, all through the biblical prose. And I would argue that it's crucial to understand the ways in which one story parallels another in order to make sense of the whole story.
I don't know what to say, but I am going to move and enroll in school under you because I'm just enjoying this so much. This is absolutely fantastic stuff. So in my podcast, I have a break between my interview where I do a little bit of a lighthearted Rorschach mental call and response. So I'm going to throw some concepts at you, and then I want you to just give me your basic your quick knee-jerk response. I call it take it easy.
Take it easy. Take it easy.
Pretty slow, I gotta tell you. I'm not a fast thinker.
Okay, all right. Well, these aren't too bad. These aren't too bad. The White Sox or the Cubs?
Cubs.
There you go. Excellent answer. Pre-critical. I just stumbled over my own words. Pre-critical or critical?
Pre-critical.
Deep dish or thin crust?
Thin crust, New York.
Oh
Brooklyn.
no! Oh.
Gooey. Folding the
Uh-huh.
triangle so that all the cheese doesn't go off your pizza.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. SBL or ETS?
Both.
That's all right. That's permissible here. Coffee or tea?
Well, definitely coffee, although lately tea, much to my chagrin.
And then with contaminants or straight?
With contaminants.
Constantine or Constantine?
Constantine.
Adam or Israel?
Both and.
Verse or text?
Next.
Uh-huh. Satan or the adversary?
Both and.
Book or movie version?
Book.
Moses or Jesus?
Because of Moses, Jesus.
Augustine or Augustine?
Augustine.
Amen, brother. Amen. That just made up for the deep dish comment. Echo or intertextuality?
Both.
Okay, yeah. All right, thanks. I call that little respite take it easy.
Take it easy.
All right, so let's say you have a class of Christians that have been reading the Bible, for quite some time. They're familiar with it, but they're not familiar with your thought pattern on this. What would you say to them? Okay, class, before you need to read the Bible, there are certain things you need to correct about the way you think about reading the Bible. What would you say?
Yeah. Again, I think I'm going to sound very repetitive.
Okay.
But simply remove the whole notion of verses and chapters. I think that's something that's very problematic. We have in our library a Torah scroll that survived the Holocaust. It's a 250-year-old Torah scroll from Germany. And when you look at it, you can see that it's on one scroll. And obviously it was read that way for generations. It was not read in terms of chapters and verses. And of course you have larger divisions and things like that. But I would just encourage people to just think in terms of the principle of the part in the whole.
Okay. A thought came to my mind that I want to throw at you that's off script. Where did it go? Oh, what are your thoughts on chiasm as a literary device?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of chiasm. I think sometimes when you read different scholars, everybody will kind of approach a text and they'll find all different kind of shapes and chiasms. In other words, it seems very typically quite subjective in my experience. I'm not saying that it's not a literary device, but I am saying that it seems, given how many scholars, different scholars will come at it and everybody will come at different conclusions, I think it's a bit more subjective. I think there are other more tangible, objective literary devices in my experience, like inclusio, I think is very clear. As I said, literary analogy, I think it's quite clear, and I think as long as you're being responsible and sticking to some really good criteria. Chiasm, again, I'm sure it exists, but I tend to be skeptical because I find that people find chiasms everywhere.
one of the things that I did in a few of my episodes is to talk about reading the Bible as a whole from Genesis to Revelation. And I suggested asking these questions and suggesting that there's more that you need to know. You need to know more before you start reading Genesis 1, 2, and 3 and following, because of what you're talking about with literary analysis. That is, that there are concepts in those 3 chapters that exist in subsequent revelation that inform your reading of those early chapters. And so I suggested, light suggestion, to think about the entire corpus of Genesis to Revelation as a chiasm, with the exilic prophets informing the language of what came before and also what follows after, because of Israel's experience in exile and the literary connections that begin in Genesis, and then also follow through with informing how to read the New Testament.
So maybe if I'm allowed to ask you a question, I'm not so sure I'm following what you mean in this context by chiasm.
Well, if you were to, I suppose, place all 66 books subsequently or sequentially on a piece of paper, and then simply go to the middle of that and pinch the middle and then pull it out so that it becomes the focus, the fulcrum of the chiasm. So that Genesis and Revelation, with chiasm, right, each of the structures matches each of the subsequent structures. So the first, like you're saying with inclusio, I would consider Genesis and Revelation as inclusio. Okay. So when you have Revelation 21 and 22 talking about the heavens and the earth, that is informative about making a connection with Genesis 1. That's an inclusio.
So I would be a little bit hesitant to call it inclusio. I mean, I've got a couple of questions here. So when you talk about the 66 books in the dead center as the fulcrum, I'm wondering what shape of the canon you're referring to.
Yeah, right. You got to be a little bit loose with it, because I'm just being general. You know, which of those prophetic books is going to be the actual fulcrum? I'm just being general in thinking about the structure, at least in that fashion.
I would also say the whole notion of 66 books would be something I'd love to correct as well.
Yeah, okay, good. Right, good.
Right, because the Torah is a book and Samuel is a book, 1st and 2nd
right.
John is
one
book.
Yeah.
You know, Ezra and Nehemiah, one book, and so it kind of throws the count off, at least
Sure.
in the Old Testament.
Sure. Now, would you prefer keeping Malachi or Chronicles as the capstone of?
Yeah, I would definitely go with Chronicles, but let me just go back to inclusio a second before I've got a mind that jumps around very easily. But as I understand inclusio, I would be hesitant to call Revelation and Genesis an inclusio. Now that may sound bad, but let me explain to you. Let me explain to you why I'd be hesitant. As I understand inclusio, it's the literary device of an author of a single text. In other words, I would look at, for instance, Isaiah 1 and Isaiah 65 and 66. You've got inclusios. I would look at, the beginning of Book 4 and the end of Book 4 of the Psalter with Moses, an inclusio. I would look at the beginning of Psalm 8 and the end of Psalm 8, an inclusio. It's an intentional literary device whereby an author brackets sections of his work and ultimately whole books. I would argue that, obviously you've got the divine author, but I think here, the Bible, I do believe in a divine author, but I move far away from the dictation theory or something. I see very much a human element. So I would simply say that Revelation is not an inclusio with Genesis, but it's very much a conscious attempt to close a canon. It clearly is unconsciously going back to the beginning to bring closure to the whole. But I think I would hesitate to call it an inclusio, because my fear then would be it would almost be as if you the the belief there would be that the divine author kind of supersedes the human author. And I'm very hesitant with that because I see I personally believe in full cooperation between the earthly and the heavenly author. So that's the only reason why I give you maybe a little bit of pushback on using the word inclusio.
Oh yeah, sure, no problem. So how would you feel though, because you mentioned it already, and I think I would consider this a nuance of what I'm saying, is that in a literary analysis, you have John intentionally, he knows what he's doing. He knows that he's bringing a closure to the New Testament revelation, and so he intentionally is making that point. So that's where I would maybe nuance it, and I completely agree with you in terms of both the divine and human aspect.
So I completely agree. In other words, I totally see that Revelation is clearly a conscious attempt to go back and bring some closure. In fact, I also see in the book of Revelation a lot of Exodus imagery. In other words, there's this whole notion of literary analogy. There's plenty of literary analogy also in the book of Revelation, and so there's no question. What was his name? Koravar, Henrik Koravar, wrote an article where he argues that Chronicles is the intentional canonical closure to the Old Testament, where the book of Chronicles mentions and alludes to not only the first book of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, starting in Genesis, but it ends with an allusion to the last book of the Hebrew Bible, the penultimate book of the Hebrew Bible, which would be Ezra Nehemiah, with the reference to Cyrus's decree. So there's an intentional canonical closure, okay? And I would see that the book of Revelation is doing the very same thing, where it's kind of bringing in and alluding to everything before it to bring canonical closure. So I agree with you there. I hesitate to use the word inclusio simply because I want to kind of hold on to that term as a literary strategy that's used in the composition of individual texts.
So is there in your mind a figure of speech then that would be more broadly used so that you would see it as an intertextual figure of speech? So rather than inclusio, because you're isolating that with a single author and a single text, is there that concept in a more broad? Does that make any sense, or am I just going down the wrong rabbit trail?
As I hear myself speaking, obviously Seth Postell is making up the rules as he goes. In other words, this is something.
I'm good with that.
Here, I think I've really tried very hard to, at least the way I teach my students, I tried my very best to teach them textual responsibility, and so I want to avoid a mystical understanding where you accredit things to God that the human authors don't know, because you can justify a whole bunch of interpretations that way.
Amen.
The Holy God, when somebody tells you the Holy Spirit told me, how do you argue with that without being, rejecting the work of God? So, I don't know if I would I'd have to think, intertextuality is clearly at work in the book of Revelation. There's never a single citation, but the whole book is drenched with imagery from the Old Testament. So you can't avoid, the whole notion of intertextuality, echo, and there is definitely a conscious attempt on John's part to bring closure to the canon by going back to the beginning. I haven't thought in terms of a literary term that would go beyond, echo intertextuality. There's something about using inclusio that I want to just keep for individual books, so that we're doing very careful literary analysis of authorial intent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's fine. Great. All right, so one of my natural questions, but it's also poignant for you, is to ask this question: what role do you believe the opening chapters of Genesis play in establishing understanding the rest of the biblical narrative?
Wow. How long is this podcast? Because it could take a long time.
Yeah, it's fine, yeah.
So I don't know if you don't have any visual aids in a podcast, but as I understand the shaping of the Hebrew Bible, okay, and just a word on that is I do see that Jesus talks about all the blood from Abel to Zechariah, a reference to Genesis, the first death. Zechariah, his death is recorded in Chronicles, and so Jesus is talking about the A to Z from the beginning to the end of the Hebrew Bible. You'll be accountable for that revelation. You have in Emmaus, you've got the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. My assumption when you use the word Psalms is that it still didn't have a name yet for the third part of the canon, and so Psalms was a way to refer to the whole body of literature because, of course, in the book of Luke, there's other passages from the writings that are really crucial. It refers to the book of Daniel and different other books in the writings. So that said, if you can, and Stephen Dempster in Dominion and Dynasty, I think he did a really good job. If you look at the shape of the Hebrew Bible, you have the law, which is Genesis to Deuteronomy, one book. You've got the prophets, okay, and the prophets are divided into the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, no Ruth is in the writings, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Okay, so that's the former prophets, and you've got the latter prophets, would be Isaiah to Malachi, and then you've got the writings. And what's really interesting, and I think this is quite intentional, is that if you look at Genesis to 2 Kings, so in other words, from the Torah to the former prophets, you actually have nearly, almost to the word, I think there's about a 2,000 word difference. Half the Hebrew Bible is a single narrative. From the creation of the world to the 37th year of the Babylonian exile. And in other words, because half the Hebrew Bible is a story, I believe that story has to affect the way you understand the prophets, the latter prophets. It has an impact on the way you put context and bones and flesh on the writing. So all this to simply say what I would argue. If I look at the introduction to this large narrative that begins in Genesis and ends in 2 Kings, the introduction is clearly Genesis 1 through 11. In fact, Genesis 1 through 11 is the introduction to the Torah as well. Okay? And when you look at Genesis 1 through 11, you see that all the elements, all the major plot of the rest of that narrative is already revealed in Genesis 1 through 11. So you have the creation mandate, right, which involves blessing, seed, and land. All the key elements that are involved in the choosing of Abraham and the election of Israel and the calling of the Messiah. You see Adam brought into the Garden of Eden, just like Israel brought into the Promised Land. He's called to conquer, Genesis 1:28. Translations usually use subdue, but the word is conquer. And in Hebrew, lichbosh et haaretz, to conquer the land, part of Israel's mandate. In Genesis 3, he's brought into the land. And by the way, he's given a law. He's got to keep the commandments, and his abiding in that special land is contingent on the keeping of the commandments. In Genesis 3, he's tempted by this native inhabitant. In the end of Genesis chapter 3, he's kicked out of the land, and he goes into exile. And there's this eastern progression of exile until it ends in Babylon, Genesis chapter 11. And remarkably, what you have there is, in a nutshell, Joshua through 2 Kings. That's the storyline. Now, why is that significant? Because in the context of that storyline, Genesis 3:15 focuses on a key aspect of the plot, which is a battle between seeds, okay, a chosen seed. And that would take hours to unpack, but what's significant, I would argue, is that already paves the way for the election of David. Because in the context of that same story, where Adam's about to go into exile, but there's the hope of a seed, you've got the election of David as the hope for humanity even after exile. And so what I would say is that Genesis 1 through 11 functions as the lens by which you have to understand the rest of the story. It informs your theology so that think in terms of conflict, plot. Plot is conflict resolution. Well, what's the conflict in Genesis 1 through 11? Disobedience to the law, curses, exile, the very same conflict we see going on in the rest of the Hebrew Bible. So then what's the resolution? What's the solution? I would argue a chosen seed. And obviously I would see that in Genesis 3:15, it certainly paves the way to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Israel. And it also goes beyond to the Messiah through David. And so I would argue it radically affects the way you have your theology of the Torah, your theology of Sinai, your theology of the New Testament. The things that the prophets are saying make no sense apart from Genesis 1 through 11, open exile, the promise of a chosen seed. So, in a nutshell, I could go on and on and on, but that's how I see the significance of Genesis 1 through 11. The whole notion of a Messiah makes no sense apart from Genesis 1 through 11.
Yeah, I'm going to have to send you an email, and we'll have to reschedule another time. We'll unpack that a little bit more, give you some more time to talk about that, because I'm just sitting here thinking I'm in Sunday school class, wishing I had a notepad and paper to take your notes. So that's some fantastic stuff. Okay, we've talked a lot in our questions, and you've already noticed, and you said I'm going to just be repeating myself when I answer your questions. But I want to, because we're about 3/4 of the way through, or 2/3 of the way through the time that we have allotted, and I want to try to ask some questions that I have thought about, and see what you think about them. One thing that I want to ask, and it has to do. One of the things that I say in my podcast is dealing with dealing with translation. And so the way that I phrase it is, as we in our own native language, wherever we're from, the translation that we are reading is an interpretation. Okay, for good or bad, and you've already mentioned the chapter divisions and the versification. That in itself is an interpretive influence. Paragraph divisions and all of those kinds of things. Let's talk a little bit about the ending of Genesis 2 and the beginning of Genesis 3 with the description of the first couple and the serpent.
Yes.
I believe I can't remember if it's Aleph, Resh, and Mem, but the first couple is described as naked, and the serpent is also described as shrewd.
Yes.
Okay, now we don't get that in the English.
So I would even shy away from shrewd.
Right. So let me say this. So when I first came across that, I'm not sure where it was from, but I started rethinking, and I thought, okay, if I'm going to translate into the English and I want to make a visual alliteration somehow, here's the way I put it. I said, and the man and the woman were both supple and not ashamed. Now the serpent was more subtle. So you have at least a consonance in terms of the sound of the words, supple and subtle. Supple being, related to nakedness. They're immature, they are naive, they are easily influenced. But then you've got the serpent who is, subtle. But anyway, my point, not to necessarily defend my point, but to have you talk about what you think the author is doing with the obvious connection in the Hebrew.
Sure. It's actually a wonderful question. It's actually an article that I'm working on now. It's a fantastic question, and I've thought about it a lot. So the challenge is, in sometimes choosing to highlight connections in one place, you actually hide connections in other places. And so in this case, I'll just give you my thoughts. As I understand Genesis 2:4 through 3:1, at least 3:1a, okay? As I understand that, what it's doing is it's setting up a before picture, before the fall. And so what you have here is in Genesis 2:25, it says that both of them were naked. And the word there is with an ayin, right? Arum. Okay, so they were arumim. They were naked before the fall, and they did not shame one another. As I understand the Hifyu would be definitely a reflexive, that they did not shame one another. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, in the very next verse it says, "And the serpent was arum more than all the beasts of the field." Now, it is clear that he's using a homonym. The words actually have different roots. Arum, the root is ara. Arum, the root is aram. They're different roots that come from different words, okay? But here's what I understand happening here. In 2:25, it says that the couple were arumim. Well, in 3:6, after they've eaten the fruit, after they ate the fruit, it says, 3:7, that now they know that they are erumim. Okay, it also means naked, but you clearly have a difference in spelling.
Yeah.
Something has shifted before
Right.
and after.
Right.
The word there, 7, has to do with, it's the same word used in the curses of the law when Israel is naked and going to exile.
Right.
Okay. Now, I would argue, therefore, that because I understand 2:25 in a positive sense, they were arumim, and they did not shame one another. In 3:1, and I'm not going to translate it yet, it says, "Now the serpent was arum, more than all the beasts of the field." Interestingly enough, in 3:14, he goes from being arum, more than all the beasts of the field, to arur, more than all the beasts of the field. A before and an after. A before and an after. In other words, I would argue that arum, in the context also of wisdom literature, and particularly in Proverbs, it's a positive thing. It's to be, and here's how I would do it, clever. And so I would argue that the serpent goes from clever to cursed, from arum to arur. And so, in my own personal opinion, the serpent falls here as well. That's how I understand the contrast here. Interesting, just a couple thoughts here. The Septuagint and the Targums also understood arum in 3:1 as wise, phronimos, hakim, wise. Interesting, Jesus says in Matthew, we're to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. And it's almost a verbatim citation of Genesis 3:1. So as I understand it, the point of the connection between 2:25 and 3:1, and I'm sorry it's taking so long.
Oh, no, not at all.
It's to establish a similarity between the two to show a pre-fall state. In other words, we have to see the serpent, we interpret the serpent in light of the man and the woman. They started off good. These are the consequences of the fall. The serpent started off clever, and then he becomes cursed. So that's how I understand the linkages there. It sets up a before-after picture.
Okay. Now, would you feel compelled if you were asked to translate those? Would you feel compelled to make a connection in, let's just say, for instance, in the English, so that the English reader would make that visual connection? Like remember you said this before, we watch movies today, we understand plot and resolution, but again, in our translation, if we go to the typical translation, they don't make that connection. So the typical reader is going to miss it. They are not going to see it. In my opinion, I'm going to argue in my ignorance, I'm going to argue that if we don't translate the intention of the author, we are subverting the intention of the author. So how would you play with that conflict of the description of the first couple and the serpent? And in your mind, I'm throwing this at you right now, how would you want the English reader to see that there is a connection there?
So as I said, here's the challenge at work here, because there's a poetry of this text. There's a beautiful symmetry of before and after. And so for instance, let's say that I call attention between the similarities between 2:25 and 3:1. If I do that, then I've actually blurred the distinctions between the similarities between 2:25 and 3:7, naked and naked, right? And then 3:1 and 3:14 between clever and cursed. In other words, you're kind of put yourself in a bit of a dilemma, because in highlighting one, you sacrifice the other. And so at that point, I would probably try as best as I can to go for the larger symmetry, the poetry of the passage. And the way that I could do that is by highlighting the fact that naked and, that clever is something positive before the fall and cursed after the fall. It's kind of a tricky one here, because you're asking me to choose between two very important literary aspects of the text that are both important. And so at that point, I would then have to ask myself, which translation is going to better aid the non-Hebrew reader to see the authorial intent? And I would then go with, I would have to go with the clever and the cursed, as I would probably want to highlight that, because I think that's a crucial aspect of the dimensions of the text. There may be some other words that I haven't kind of hashed out. I've been in Israel for many years, and my English is already not as strong as it used to be. And maybe there are some words we can come up with that kind of can highlight all the connections. I just don't know how that's possible in this case.
Yeah. Wow. So good. All right. Couple of things. I took Genesis with Bruce Waltke, and I remember his talking about Genesis 4 with Cain and Abel, and the two things that he mentioned. The first thing that he mentioned was the difficulty of understanding the way that we translate, and it came to pass. And then the other conflict that he brought up in question was to understand how Cain got off so easily from killing his brother. It seems that even though he was cursed and sent out, and we see later on in the law that murderers are to be put to death, or actually even with Noah after the flood, that murderers are supposed to be put to death, he asks the question, what about Cain? The first thing that I want to suggest is that, as you've already mentioned with Christ in Matthew 23, talking about the blood of the prophets, where I'm thinking right now is that Cain's the justice against Cain for killing his brother is put off eschatologically until we see Christ bringing it to head on the generation that he's speaking. So that's what he means. Basically, Jesus gives an explanation of why we see Cain not punished for the blood of shedding innocent blood, and that is that Jesus says the justice of that is put off, but it's now coming to head upon this generation. And then I see that as a connection to Deuteronomy 32, where God talks about avenging the blood of avenging the blood of his people upon the wicked who shed innocent blood. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in fact, one of the things I really do least in one of the things you're saying here, is that you're looking to Deuteronomy 32, the Song of Moses, as sort of again, we talked earlier about inclusios. And so there's a lot of connections between Genesis 32 and 33 and the introduction to the Pentateuch. Lots. And so I think and you're raising a thought about the vengeance that I hadn't actually ever considered. I think it would be something I'd have to go back and ponder it and look at it. But I like what you're saying. My understanding of Genesis 4, and I mean, you're probably raising issues that maybe I haven't thought about. One of the things I have given a lot of attention to is the crucial nature of Genesis 4 in terms of our understanding of Genesis 3:15. In other words, Genesis 4 shatters any notion that Genesis 3:15 is simply an etiology that explains just natural hatred between people and snakes.
Yeah, right.
So I would argue that Genesis 4 sort of helps us to start to look back at this conflict between two seeds. And suddenly we realize that the seed of the serpent has been understood and interpreted metaphorically as a seed that opposes the plan of God. And so now the seed of the serpent is not baby snakes. The seed of the serpent are actually individuals that oppose God and oppose God's chosen line.
You have now again just hit on really the point of my podcast, because I remember as a kid in my little Baptist church that I went to, learning that is exactly what the passage is about, why people hate snakes.
Well, can I just tell you something, though? That's actually a very common evangelical explanation today. In fact, there's a lot of evangelical scholars, I won't even mention their names, that would argue along the lines of Rashi that Genesis 3:15 is simply the natural consequences of sin in the world. So, for instance, they would argue that, one of the things that Rashi did, and it created quite it's sort of an apologetic against a messianic interpretation. It's actually quite powerful. And he went along the lines, he simply said that if you look at the word for blow, it's the same word. So, Adam, the seed of the woman gives a blow to the serpent's head, and the serpent gives a blow to the foot. And our inclination, our typical default, is to argue that the seed of the woman, that the serpent receives the more mortal blow. Okay, and therefore, the seed of the woman is injured, whereas the serpent is killed. However, the problem with that is that if we're talking about a poisonous serpent, which we likely are, a person kills a serpent by stepping on his head. A serpent kills a person by striking at the heel, which is a very thing we see in Genesis 49:17. That's how serpents killed, is they struck at the heel. And so what you end up having here are two death blows. And so then from there, Rashi simply basically concluded, you can't have one winning over the other. It's just a never-ending cycle of violence between people and serpents. And so that just like women have pain in childbirth, so in the natural world, there's a never-ending battle between people and snakes. The only problem with that interpretation is it's unbelievably atomistic, because what you have through Genesis 4 through 11, on several occasions, are very key allusions back to Genesis 3:15. In other words, the best interpretation of Scripture is Scripture, going back to literary analogy. So, for instance, the story of Cain and Abel and Seth brings in key elements of the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent. And interestingly enough, in chapter 3, the serpent is cursed. In chapter 4, Abel is cursed. And there are key links between Abel and the serpent. And then you have in chapter 4, verse 25, the naming of Seth recalls key verses or a cluster of words that appear elsewhere only in Genesis 3:15. So what you end up having is an interpretation. Cain and his behavior is identified as a seed of the serpent. Seth is identified as the seed of the woman. And that continues on through Genesis 4 through 11. My point being, in fact, in Sunday school, and I didn't grow up in Sunday school, but I've heard that the default position far often is to see Genesis 3:15 as messianic. And whereas I would agree with that idea, I think that many evangelicals can't defend that position. And I find that many evangelical scholars would actually argue that Genesis 3:15 is only talking about people and snakes. And so I would simply say in this case that Mrs. Smith or Mr. Joe actually is righter than he realizes, and he just can't defend himself because of a very sophisticated attempt to make this an etiology. But I would argue in a careful literary reading of Genesis 4 through 11, you really see that what that does is it identifies 3:15 as a key feature of the plot of the rest of the Torah.
Now, I didn't want to interrupt you, but you did say that Abel was cursed. Did you misspeak?
No. Did I say Abel? I
Yeah.
meant Cain.
Yeah, that's what I thought, but I didn't want to interrupt you. But yeah.
Cain.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, that's
Cain.
okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
All right. So then my second thought on this passage is to suggest this thought, that when we read that, and it came to pass, that seems to me the same construct that we see in Daniel 12:13, where Daniel is told that at the end of days he will stand up again. So that the phrase is not, and it came to pass, but rather should be consistently translated at the end of days.
Where are you looking at? I'm a bit confused here.
I think it's 4:3, Genesis 4:3.
I see. So, okay, Miketz Yamim, the end of days.
And that's, I believe, the very same phrase that's at Daniel 12:13. To me, that's a literary connection that can't be glossed over.
So, Miketz Yamim, it appears in 2 Samuel 14, 1 Kings 17, Jeremiah 13, Nehemiah 13:6. In Daniel, let's see, Daniel 12, what is it, 1?
No, I think it's 12:13.
12:13. Miketz Hayamim. So it's not exactly, but it's close.
Okay.
Not exactly what's close. I've never. The crazy thing or the exciting thing about reading the Bible is you can read the same passage over and over and over and over and over and over again, and always miss details. So
here,
go ahead.
So here's my connecting thought then. If we look at what Jesus is talking about in terms of the vindication of the shedding of innocent blood, and we see that at the end of days in Genesis 4:3, if we're gonna use that connection, that is an eschatological connection that puts the events of Cain and Abel in the context of what Jesus brings to a conclusion in his generation. So that at the end of days, Jesus is basically saying, okay, Abel is finally going to be vindicated from the shedding of his blood by his brother. It's coming down. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think here's probably my hesitancy on two levels with that interpretation. The first is that, I would want to look at all the other instances where Miketz Yamim shows up, and it is interesting that, 2 Samuel 14:26, when he cut the hair of his head, and it was at the end of every year. So we're talking about Absalom. And I'm wondering if we're going to take that same phrase and understand that eschatologically there. Or in 1 Kings 17:7, with, Elijah, and it happened that while the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land, and at the end of the time, the brook dried up. And Jeremiah 13:6, arise and go to Euphrates, place in which I commanded, let's see here, after many days. And then in Nehemiah, okay, I would want to see that phrase is somewhat consistent. That's the first thing. In other words, I'd kind of push back and say, I want to look at that phrase and how it's used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. Secondly, the Hebrew Bible does, or the Torah does talk about the last days, and that's used 4 times. And the word there is acharit yamim. It's not the word ketz yamim. It's acharit yamim. And that is a key concept in the Torah. So that said, I'm not, again, I'm a slow thinker. It would take me some time to cook on what you're saying.
Yeah, that's great. No. Yeah.
Hesitant would be simply to say, I would love to see some consistency where I can see acharit yamim used, the last days, very clearly in eschatological contexts every time it's used, in my opinion, right? In ketz yamim, right, is not, and that doesn't say, interestingly enough, whereas in Daniel, the yamim, the days, has the direct article. It has the article, hayamim, the days. So there, it's clearly an identifiable period of time at the end of the days. But that's not what Genesis 4:3 says. It actually says at the end of days. And as I said, that phrase is used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, and I don't see in those other instances where it has any kind of eschatological sense at all.
Okay. So just out of curiosity, what program are you looking at?
The best.
Logos?
No, accordance.
Accordance, okay. Funnily enough, when I went to RTS Orlando, I had a friend who was responsible for writing the program for accordance. And I was employed very briefly to help with some editing, but I just was not IT savvy, and so it just was not a good fit. But I had my fingers in accordance before it was really big. But so
interestingly enough, Roy Brown is practically my neighbor. He's the Roy and Helen, the CEOs of Accordance, actually, live part time of the year in Israel, and he's a very good friend of our college, and I have the privilege of, when I have issues with Accordance, I just call him and we talk. And so I'm very blessed, because I would never have been smart enough to figure. I'm not so very tech savvy, but our students use Accordance, and I absolutely love it, especially for careful textual analysis. It's really an easy thing to use.
Excellent. Well, hey, we just turned over into the second hour, so or the end of the second hour. So I'm gonna wrap this up, but I'm gonna tell you something. This has been for me the most enjoyable episode I have ever done. So I want to thank you, Seth, for graciously allowing me to steal you away from whatever other responsibilities you had today. But I'm also going to ask you to think about possibly coming back for us to talk about other things that might have taken germination in your mind, and by the time we talk, you've got more to say about those things.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Be a privilege. I've enjoyed this. I've enjoyed the questions. They're great questions, and thank you very much, Travis.
Excellent. And I'm going to look into trying to sneak down to Lynchburg when you're there in October.
Oh, that would be great.
That'd be fantastic. All right. Well, thanks again so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day and your summer. Do they have summer there? Is there
Yeah. We ended our semester in June, and we'll. The way that the semester system works here is we start back up after Sukkot, after the Feast of Booths is when school opens again. So, although you should know that we actually do have an international program, a Year in Israel program, and so our international calendar works with the American system, and they start up at the beginning of September.
Okay. All right. Well, Seth, God bless. Take care, and I'll just keep your eye out. I'll be filling your email box with a lot of follow-up questions and thoughts.
Great. Hey, thanks so much, Travis.
All right.
Great to meet you.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. I think that was a fantastic interview. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And as I said before, we will be having a follow-up interview next week with Seth Postell. All right. So make sure you visit on iTunes and give good reviews. 5 stars, thumbs up, all that kind of stuff. If you want to send me a voice memo with any thoughts or questions or challenges, you can do that by emailing rethinkmemo@gmail.com, and I'll play it on an upcoming episode. And then also keep your eye out and thoughts for contributions with donations when the website gets established and all of that good stuff. So until next time.